Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you're all doing great, as I always say. And in this video, we got a story from Nevada from 2013. And in finding out it's from 2013, I realized that 2013 was 9 years ago and had a bit of a moment. And since that is from 2013, it's definitely made its rounds probably by now. But it's one of the first stories that I found way back in the day that got me into finding stories on the internet and all that. So, pull up a stump and let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. Now, I'm not a writer by any means, so please forgive me if my writing style isn't the greatest. Whether this story is paranormal, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or man-made, I'll have to leave it up to you, as I still can't decide for myself. You see, I like to fancy myself as a survivalist, or some of you refer to us as preppers. I live in Nevada, about a good hour outside of Las Vegas. For certain reasons, I'm obviously keeping the exact location a secret, and I'm purposely distorting some location things. For those of you that don't know, a good 90% of Nevada is government or military-owned land. A lot of it is free to roam, though. The only areas that you really shouldn't venture to are well-fenced, clearly marked, and for good reasons, really. There are still many active radioactive sites, as well as government testing facilities, bombing ranges, and other things of that nature. They aren't really that exciting, to be honest, and usually only have some concrete foundations or like a target shack or something like that, but they're probably hazardous to your health or safety and all that. The sites that aren't are usually fully manned military bases where they just experiment with drones and stuff. Now, as for the experience I had, I've never been big on the paranormal phenomenon side of things, but I do acknowledge that our government has several high-tech projects that they keep veiled, and there's things that we don't understand. But again, what I experienced made me question these beliefs. It was about a month ago. It was on a warm spring night, and it starts to warm up early out here. When you guys were all getting snow, it was hitting about 80 Fahrenheit here during midday. I had a vacation time that I had yet to cash in on, and it was nearing the point of expiration, so I took it, not really having any plans or foresight as to what I wanted to do with my 2 weeks off. I did, however, take some of my savings, and I cashed in on an IR laser for my rifle, and a night vision monocular headset. I've always had trouble sitting still, knowing that there's nothing to be productive with. My mind starts racing, coming up with hundreds of project ideas. I finally settled on the idea of camping. Unfortunately, most of my friends were busy with the drudgery of work, and no one I knew was willing to get away for the week. It dawned on me that I had never tried camping for a lengthy period of time, alone, for good reason though. The desert is a nasty place to get stranded, and death is a very real possibility, should something go terribly wrong. Between hydration, broken bones, and rattlesnakes, you definitely have to be careful out there. The only thing I could really think of to combat this would be to take along my 5-watt ham radio and research the closest repeaters to different choice areas that I have. I could call for help if things went south, and my Yuko M76 just in case. So after doing some research and quick site planning, I settled on an area that I honestly didn't know very well, but it looked promising. It has several abandoned silver mines, washes for shelter, and generally good wildlife to watch or take pot shots at. Of course, if anyone from PETA got wind of my ventures, they would probably throw a fit over the number of jackrabbits and coyotes that I've shot out there. So once settling on my location, I began to pack. This wasn't difficult, as I usually keep my bug-out bag ready in my closet, but I decided it was a good time to cycle out old inventory. This time was a bit different though. I decided to bring a few more electronics with me than usual, including my ham radio, my night vision monocular, and a solar charger just in case. I left my cell phone behind, and I decided to rely on a good old-fashioned map and compass for navigation. From an early age in Boy Scouts, I've known how to navigate the old-fashioned way, I decided that I wanted to test my rusty skills and see how well I remembered the UTM coordinate system. The electronics were some night fun and emergencies only. I woke up at 3:30 a.m. on day 2 of my vacation, and I was excited and ready to head out. I decided to load up on crap before hitting the highway and stopped and got some coffee and donuts, looking like some ridiculous commando on a dirt bike. After getting my sweet black nectar and a load of simple carbs, I headed off. The weather was great, and the wind rushing over my face felt wonderful. As I got a few miles away from the turnoff, I remembered that there was a native gas station fairly close to the exit as well. The native reservation boundaries are an odd shape, and for about a mile the highway went right through the middle of it, offering anyone who stopped in some tax-free gas. I stopped in after topping off my tank, and the cashier asked me where I was off to. I told her where I was going, and I was planning to go camping. She mentioned that there was an Air Force base a few miles away, and they had been doing some testing, and warned me not to get lost in their target range. And this is definitely something to take seriously because they do drop live ordnance. I thanked her for the advice, and I headed out. It was early morning, and I continued to enjoy the feeling of wind on my face, and the liberating feeling of being able to break free of any social obligations for a while. I reached the turnoff area, where it was this all-dirt gravel road from there on. I performed a quick test on my ham radio, set the repeater to offset, and I verified reception was clear. The dial tone registered, and I got a familiar weather forecast for the day. I was ready to begin. So I headed down the dirt trail, and I soldiered on through the bumps and washes. My bike frantically kicked up dust and rocks until I finally reached a couple fork points in the trail. At this point, I couldn't quite remember which direction I was supposed to go, as I had only been in the area once before with a friend, and he drove. I looked at my map and got what I believed to be a good bearing, and then I headed off down the trail. Now, when I say trail, these are more like gravel roads that sometimes end or bring you to a military base, encampment, or even just one of the small encampments around the state, or sometimes even a wildlife preserve, or even BLM land and campsites. If you accidentally venture onto a military one, it's not really that big of a deal. They'll usually just turn you around or wave you off, so I wasn't too horribly concerned about a run-in with anything unless you're up near Groom Lake. That's a different beast. After driving down this particular trail for a while, I realized, oh, I'm lost. None of the landscapes looked familiar, and I had traveled a good 25 miles before reaching anything that looked like a decent campsite. I had packed plenty of water and food, so I wasn't concerned about finding a spring or anything edible. I had also remembered the way in which I came, so I wasn't really a big issue either. At this point, I just decided it was adventuring time, and I drove on for a while until I found a campsite. I decided it was suitable for a short stay. I ended up settling at the base of a mountain near a dried-up wash. It was a really nice area, actually. There were a few Joshua trees and some trenches to set up in for some decent afternoon shade. It wasn't the rainy season at this point, so the threat of a flash flood taking me out wasn't really a concern either. So after getting set up, I threw on my camel pack, grabbed my rifle, and filled my flask with a bit of vodka just for fun. I was my own man now, and had to answer to no one. I walked around a bit, heard the familiar sounds of cicadas, and I headed towards another dry wash bed near the base of the mountain. After walking for a bit, I quickly became bored and took a swig of vodka. Sometimes it can take a bit just to detach from normal life and relax. I decided after my drink that it was time to start setting up targets, and pushed my Yugo M76 to its limits. After setting up a few targets, I was good to go. I walked back to my campsite, identifying local plant life and inspecting oddly shaped rocks. I wasn't really in any hurry. I stirred up a jackrabbit on the way back who was less than happy to see my presence way out there in the valley. I shouldered my rifle to take a pot shot at it, and then noticed something else in the corner of the scope. I adjusted the zoom to get a closer look. It was a freshly killed coyote. I decided to let our little rabbit friend go and headed towards the coyote carcass. The closer I got, the more pungent the air became. The smell of rotting meat was heavy. When I got closer to it, two things struck me as slightly odd. The pelt wasn't completely removed, but what had been was fairly clean, and there weren't any missing extremities. Coyotes are considered a nuisance, so you can shoot them freely, but usually grabbing the pelt, tail, or paw is pretty common. And number two, it didn't look like there had been any injury or exit wounds from a bullet. Being a bit confused, I just wrote it off as a sloppy hunter who had found a coyote, dead of natural causes, and was scamming some farmer offering bounties for hides. Sometimes cannibalism can happen in coyote packs, but it's not very common. So I made it back to camp and I started myself a fire. I drank down a shot or two of more liquid courage and settled on taking pot shots at the targets I set up. I tinkered around and adjusted my scope, and I tried taking the longest shots that I could. I made a couple accurate shots out to 700 meters, but I decided that I had pushed my rifle as far as I could in my slightly buzzed state. And yeah, I know, guns and alcohol are bad, but I wasn't exactly in a crowded area either, nor was I actually drunk. After letting the rifle cool down for a bit, and breaking open one of my MREs, I began cleaning it. After several failed attempts at keeping it 100% dust-free, I gave up, and just did a quick field cleaning. It wouldn't have passed the white glove test, but it was damn sure gonna work if I needed it to. After a nice 5-star MRE meal, I decided to break out my ham radio and turned it on, seeing if there were any other hams in the area. I scanned the stations and I didn't really come across anything of interest except for a few rangers reporting their status. I decided that I would do something that you're not supposed to do, and that's start scanning CAPS channels. For those that don't know, the military operates on MARS or MARS cap channels, which have a very high frequency. You can eavesdrop on them with the right radio modifications, and as long as you don't broadcast, you should be fine. I started scanning these channels and came across a little bit of chatter, but they didn't seem to have much to say either, except area status reports and all that. After a bit, I started getting bored and listening to them report all 10s and 100s and turned off my radio. Dusk was turning into darkness, so I sat for a while, just letting myself go into a trance, staring at the fire. After a bit, I began to hear a crackling coming from my bag. I grabbed the bag, assuming that some critter Gila monster had decided to make itself a new home, and instead, I found my radio was still turned on slightly. I turned it up a bit, and I realized that the sounds that I was hearing were short bursts of what sounded like gunfire over the radio. Intrigued, I turned it up, and I listened into whatever testing/war games that they were doing. As I listened into the action, I heard what can only be described as fingernails on a chalkboard, coupled with a blood-curdling scream, and a bit of a dying rabbit mixed in. As I reached for the knob to turn the volume down, I heard a pop, and then silence. My radio had gone out or blown a capacitor, and I was now without any form of communication. I sat there in silence for a moment, wondering if coming out here wasn't the best idea. After thinking about it for a few minutes and a bit of self-reassurance that I was just picking up chatter from 100 miles away, I decided that I was just letting a small stupid things like the carcass and the radio chatter get to me. For all I knew, it was just some war game being played and new equipment being tested. I decided it was time to get some sleep, and I'd just explore some more in the morning. I crawled into my tent for a bit of sleep. As I awoke the next morning and crawled out of my tent, I felt like death. My back ached and I was incredibly groggy and slow-moving. I restarted the fire, filled up my mess kit pot with water, and started boiling it while pulling out some instant coffee. I decided that today I was going to do a bit of riding around and exploring. I looked at my radio lying next to my tent and thought, I guess I better be careful. After a morning coffee and MRE eggs and bacon, I grabbed my rifle and headed out to see if I could see any signs of life or find any old abandoned equipment or buildings. I biked up a natural trail and came over a ridge to a large stretch of open valley and land. Off in the distance I could see the beginning of a military base's fence. When I saw this, I felt an incredible sinking feeling in my chest. Whatever was going on last night may well have happening just a few miles off. I shook off the feeling that I was just letting anxiety and imagination get to me. I just told myself again that it was only war games, and that the noise was probably going through the channels. I decided to just avoid the area and rode back towards the campsite, over the lower mountain ridge. As I turned back, I see something off in the distance, on the side of the mountain face. It was what looked like an abandoned silver mine, or a natural cave of sorts. At this point, my curiosity got the better of me, and I shook off all fear that I may have once had. Now I could actually do a bit of exploration. I rode up to the side, dismounted, and grabbed my night vision and rifle. I peeked in. I couldn't tell how deep it was, but it seemed more man-made than anything. The rocks looked roughly carved, and I'm not a geologist either. I couldn't really smell or hear anything, so I decided to walk in a bit farther. And I put on my night vision, and I waited for my eyes to adjust from a bright desert sun to darkness. After a second, my eyes adjusted, and I turned on my monocular. There wasn't much to be seen. I walked in for a ways, but still no signs of anything that would excite anyone other than a geologist. I could see what looked like a turn in the bit farther back. I decided against going this far in since I wasn't really experienced in spelunking or cave exploration. And this is when it hit me. There is a primal fear everyone has. People debate what it is or how we acquired it as a species, but it's there. It's a deep feeling of dread, like you feel like you're being watched or stalked by something absolutely horrific. Chills crawl up your body and you feel that something just isn't right. Well, I felt this. I immediately froze, rifle in hand, pointing down to the cave. I couldn't hear anything or see anything. I then, however, quickly realized what was wrong. The smell. It was the same pungent smell the coyote carcass was letting off. It seemed too rotten or too pungent and too strong for just a coyote carcass. Even in the sun, it just seemed off, you know what I mean? But now, I could smell it in the cave. This set off every alarm in my mind, and every ounce of fear in me told me to get the hell out of there. I slowly backed out, while shouldering my rifle and pointing it towards the back of the cave. Every rock under my boots sounded 100 times louder, and every breath I took felt like it echoed through the entire cave. As I reached the entrance, I just turned and bolted for my bike. I started up and rode back as quickly as possible. I was taking no chances now, and decided that it was probably best to just leave. Dusk was setting in as I was riding back, and I was contemplating just moving to a new site, or just calling off the trip 2 days in. I still wasn't sure if any of this meant anything, or if I had been just overreacting, but I knew some odd things have definitely been happening. As I rode closer to my campsite, I noticed everything seemed off. Nothing was how I left it. I was feeling really uneasy now, but I wasn't about to leave my expensive equipment behind. As I got closer, I realized why everything seemed off. My tent had been raided. It was torn. My mess kit was strewn about. The fire pit had been scattered, and my pack had been dumped out. I assessed the damage and realized something. Nothing was missing, just vandalized. Even my radio, solar charger, and extra ammo remained, stuff I was sure would be missing. My decision was made. I was calling it quits. I started packing up my bag and whatever I could scavenge that hadn't been ripped up. This was about the time I noticed something. There were now no more sounds at all. No cicadas, no crickets or birds, just complete silence. As I was packing, I took a drink from my flask to calm my nerves. Nothing at this point could have changed my mind about leaving. It was quickly becoming dark, and even with the night vision and a rifle, whatever was out there was obviously screwing with me now. It was obvious that this territory belonged to something else, and my hunting trip had turned the tables on me. As it got darker, I decided to scan the area first to make sure that my surroundings were clear. As I looked around, I couldn't see much other than the now familiar desert landscape. As I began to scan the area near the peak of the mountain, I saw something move. It was just visible behind a rocky area, and I tried to make out the shape, but it was distorted and hidden by larger rocks. I stared in that direction for what seemed like hours. Then it stood up. To this day, I will not forget the sheer terror and fear that I felt while looking at this thing. It's as though death and evil itself were staring right at me, and every part of my mind screamed, "This can't be real." This bipedal creature stood as though it was human, but the eyes were massive, just massive, blank, dark spots in my night vision. There was no reflection or gleam that came from them. I couldn't distinguish any real features, other than what seemed like an almost scaly texture. It just stood and looked in my direction, as though it knew that I was watching it. Then, it did something terrifying. It smiled. And it wasn't a normal smile. It was a terrible, jagged-toothed Joker grin smile. I took the safety off my rifle and I shined my IR laser at it. After a brief pause, I delivered a fatal round to its head, or so I thought. The shriek that followed was deafening, blood-curdling, and absolutely terrible to hear. It was a scream that went straight through your soul and shattered it to bits. The dying screams of someone getting their head sawn off with a rusty blade would have been more comforting at this point. I watched this thing shake and shudder for a moment, and quickly delivered another round in its direction. I think I hit a center mass, but I couldn't be sure. It ran at a pace I'm not even sure my bike could keep up with, down the ridge. Not quite in my direction, but too close for comfort. I bolted down into the wash and kept my gun trained in its direction as best I could while running. I ducked into a small crevice and waited. I could hear grunts and screeches in the distance. At first, they seemed closer, then further away. It was difficult to tell where the noises were coming from, but in the pitch blackness, I sure as hell wasn't going anywhere with that thing around. I stayed up all night, crouched in a crevice in the inside of the wash, just waiting, my gun trained at the opening, and I was kept awake only by adrenaline. It was the most exhausting and terrifying night of my life. Dawn broke and I hadn't heard any signs of the thing. It had been a good few hours since I took the first shot, but I sat and waited until the daylight was strong to even think about moving from where I was. As the sun rose and the familiar sounds of wildlife returned, I felt safe enough to venture. Very carefully, I crept out, covered in dust and feeling incredibly drained. I emerged. I looked around to see if anything was around. There were no signs of whatever the hell was hunting me last night, so I decided to man up and head to my bike. I didn't even think to grab my equipment. I just slung my rifle over my shoulder and very reluctantly started the bike, fearing whatever came last night would hear me. After running it for about a minute and no signs of movement were seen, I decided to carefully start heading out. Before that, though, I had a thought. I wondered what may have been left behind from where I scored a hit on the thing. I decided to check it out. Since everything seemed clear now, I drove up the ridge in DEFCON 1 and scanned the area, just to make sure it wasn't watching or following me. I got up to the rocky area where I first saw it hiding at, and I found a nice bit of blood splatter. I quickly grabbed a handful of earth and dried blood, and then booked it the hell out of the area. But as I was driving down the trail, that feeling came back, and I knew I was being watched again. I only drove faster and didn't look back. After I got home, out about $500 worth of gear, keeping only my rifle and a couple magazines worth of ammo and my night vision goggles, I decided to get to the bottom of this. I called up a friend of mine who works for the local university and told her the situation. I didn't really go into a lot of detail, but I explained that I had been hunting and I shot something that I wasn't sure of, and it had attacked me. She had me bring her the blood-stained rocks, and I guess did whatever test you gotta do on those, and she got back to me after about a month and basically said, I don't know what the hell this DNA is, and explained to me that it's only partially a match for about a few animals. And here's where everything gets really weird. I get a call from, I don't really know who, to be honest. They referenced my camping trip and said that it was best just to forget about it. I've also noticed people tailing me while driving and leapfrogging me on a regular basis, trading off following in shifts. That's it, really. I'm not sure where else to go from here. I'm sorry I can't really bring much closure, but now you know as much as I do. So, what did you think of that story? I know that it was long and that my voice hurts after this, but, this was actually the first story that I had found back in 2013 that got me reading internet stories and all that, so I know it's probably made its rounds by now, but I figured that I would share it because it's one of my favorites. So, do you have any stories of your own? I have an email in the description that you can send them to if you want to tell me or you want to see it in a video. I have ways that you can support the channel in the description. And yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for pulling up a stump, and I will see you in the next one.